Before you begin watching, take a moment to let me know in the comments where you're viewing from. Tonight's story takes us deep into the forgotten hollows of eastern Tennessee, where the mist hangs heavy, between mountains older than time itself. This is the account of Patsy Troxdale and the O'Neal family tragedy of 1846, a case that remains buried in courthouse archives of Morgan County, mentioned only in whispers even generations later. What makes this particular story so disturbing isn't just what happened, but how an entire community conspired to preserve a silence that persists to this day. It began with something small, the way things often do in these mountains. A young woman walking alone on a late autumn evening, returning from delivering a basket of preserves to her ailing grandmother. Patsy Troxdale was known throughout Coalfield Township for her kindness and gentle manner. The daughter of a respected physician, she had prospects that most young women in the area could only dream of: education, perhaps even marriage to someone from one of the prosperous families down in Knoxville. But on that particular evening in October, as the leaves crunched beneath her boots and the last light faded from the sky, Patsy noticed something unusual along the path home. A child's rag doll, carefully placed atop a fence post, its button eyes facing directly toward the dense woods that bordered the O'Neal property. The doll shouldn't have been there. It belonged to young Mary O'Neal, the 7-year-old daughter of Ezekiel and Sarah O'Neal, who lived in the imposing 2-story house that stood slightly apart from the other homes in Coalfield. Why would Mary's doll be out here, nearly a mile from their home, positioned as if watching the forest? As Patsy reached for it, she noticed something else: a small piece of paper tucked into the doll's crude fabric dress. 3 words written in what appeared to be Mary's uneven, childish scrawl: "He isn't Papa." That was the detail that never quite fit. The moment that, looking back, should have warned Patsy to turn around, to walk away, to forget what she'd seen. Instead, she tucked the doll under her arm and continued on her way home, unaware that she had just set in motion events that would consume her life and end several others. The O'Neal family had arrived in Coalfield Township 4 years earlier, in the summer of 1842. Ezekiel O'Neal purchased the old Hammond property, paying cash for the house and surrounding 50 acres, an unusual transaction that raised eyebrows among locals. The Hammonds had abandoned the place after 3 of their children died of fever within a week of each other. Some said the land itself was soured, but Ezekiel dismissed such talk as superstition. He was a practical man, broad-shouldered and stern, with coal-black hair and a full beard that he kept meticulously trimmed. His wife Sarah was nearly his opposite: slender, fair-haired, and remarkably quiet. She rarely spoke in public unless directly addressed by her husband. Their 3 children, Thomas, the eldest at 12, Mary 7, and little Joseph, barely 3, were similarly subdued in temperament. They attended church each Sunday, sitting perfectly still throughout the lengthy sermons. Ezekiel worked as a bookkeeper for the coal company that gave the township its name. He left early each morning and returned as dusk fell, walking with the particular measured gait of a man who believes himself watched. Sarah maintained their home, growing vegetables in the side yard and tending to the children. The family kept to themselves, which wasn't particularly unusual in a place where properties were spaced far apart and winter could isolate households for weeks at a time. Neighbors noticed that the O'Neal children didn't play with others, didn't join in the infrequent community gatherings, but this too was easily explained. Ezekiel was protective, concerned about his children's moral education. "The world corrupts innocent minds," he was heard saying once at the general store. "My children will remain pure." The only regular visitor to the O'Neal home was Reverend Caldwell, who would sometimes take Sunday dinner with the family after services. And it was Reverend Caldwell who commented, on more than one occasion, about the exceptional respect the O'Neal children showed their father. "They look at him like he's the Lord himself," the Reverend told Patsy's father. "Never seen such obedience in young ones." Beneath this portrait of domestic tranquility, however, there were whispers. Sarah O'Neal had been seen at the apothecary, requesting sleeping powders with increasing frequency. The youngest child, Joseph, often appeared at church with shadows beneath his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. And sometimes, in the deep hours of night, neighbors living nearest to the O'Neal property reported hearing what sounded like singing, a low, continuous humming that seemed to come from the root cellar behind the house. But these were merely curiosities, the sort of small-town observations that occupy idle minds. Nothing that suggested the horror that resided behind the O'Neals' polished front door. Nothing that explained why Mary O'Neal would hide a message in her doll, or why that message would contain those three particular words, "He isn't Papa." Patsy Troxdale had grown up alongside most of Coalfield's residents. Her father's position as the town physician placed their family at the center of community life, privy to the intimate details of birth, illness, and death that bound the small population together. At 23, Patsy assisted her father in his practice, having shown an unusual aptitude for medicine from a young age. She knew which herbs to gather for various tinctures, how to set a broken bone, the proper way to stitch a wound. Unmarried, but not for lack of suitors, Patsy had chosen to devote herself to learning her father's profession. She was one of the few women in the region with her own income, modest though it was. The morning after finding Mary's doll, Patsy deliberated over what to do. The message troubled her, but children often engaged in imaginative play. Perhaps it was part of a game. Still, something about those three words, their directness, their urgency, nagged at her. Rather than returning the doll directly to the O'Neal home, Patsy decided to speak with Thomas, the oldest O'Neal child, who sometimes helped at the general store after school. That afternoon, she found him stacking crates behind the counter, his movements methodical and precise. "Thomas," she said, keeping her voice casual, "I found something that I believe belongs to your sister." The boy turned, his face expressionless. When she produced the doll, something flickered in his eyes, not surprise but fear, quickly masked. "Mary lost that weeks ago," he said, not reaching for it. "She's forgotten all about it." "The doll was placed on a fence post near your property," Patsy continued, watching his reaction carefully. "It seemed deliberately positioned there." Thomas's hands tightened on the crate he was holding. "I should get back to work, Miss Troxdale." "There was a note, Thomas, inside the dress. It said, 'He isn't Papa.' Do you know what that means?" The crate slipped from the boy's hands, crashing to the floor. Canned goods spilled across the wooden planks. "I have to go," he said, his voice suddenly higher, childlike. "Please don't come to our house. Don't talk to Mary about the doll. It's better if you forget about it." Before she could respond, Thomas fled through the back door of the store, leaving the scattered merchandise behind. Mr. Finley, the store owner, emerged from the storeroom at the noise. "What in heaven's name happened here?" he demanded. Patsy stood frozen, the doll still in her hands, troubled by the naked terror she'd seen on Thomas O'Neal's face. "I'm not entirely sure," she replied. Later that same day, as twilight descended and Patsy was walking home from her grandmother's house once again, she noticed Ezekiel O'Neal standing at the edge of his property. He seemed to be waiting for her, his tall figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. As she approached, he called out to her, "Miss Troxdale, I understand you found something belonging to my daughter." His voice was pleasant enough, but something in his stance made Patsy's skin prickle with unease. "My son Thomas was quite upset when he came home, said you'd been asking him strange questions." He extended his hand. "I'd appreciate the return of my daughter's toy." Patsy hesitated, then slowly reached into her bag and handed him the doll. Ezekiel examined it carefully, his fingers probing the seams of the fabric dress. When he found the small slip of paper, he removed it, read it, and then looked up at Patsy with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Children and their games," he said, smiling, but his eyes remained cold. "My Mary has quite the imagination. Always making up stories." He tucked the paper into his pocket. "I trust this won't become a matter of gossip, Miss Troxdale. I wouldn't want people thinking there's anything unusual about my family." "Of course not, Mr. "O'Neal," Patsy replied, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "As you said, children and their games." He continued to watch her as she walked past, and she could feel his eyes on her back long after she'd moved beyond his property line. That night, she found herself unable to sleep, troubled by Thomas's reaction and the unsettling encounter with Ezekiel. Outside her window, an owl called 3 times, a sound locals considered an omen of death. 3 days later, Mary O'Neal didn't appear at school. The explanation offered by Sarah O'Neal was simple enough. Mary had fallen ill with a fever, she told the schoolteacher, Mrs. Hampton. The child would remain at home until she recovered. This wasn't unusual in itself. Childhood illnesses swept through communities with regularity, claiming some and sparing others with seemingly arbitrary cruelty. Dr. Troxdale, Patsy's father, offered to examine the girl, but Ezekiel politely declined, saying they preferred to treat her with home remedies passed down through Sarah's family. "Nothing works better for fever than willow bark tea and prayer," he said at church that Sunday, his hand resting possessively on Sarah's shoulder. The O'Neal family continued their routines. Ezekiel walked to work each morning, Thomas attended school and helped at the store. Sarah was occasionally seen purchasing supplies. Only little Joseph seemed affected by his sister's absence, appearing increasingly withdrawn when glimpsed in the yard or at church. Reverend Caldwell, after his regular Sunday dinner with the family, mentioned to Dr. Troxdale that he'd not been permitted to see Mary during his visit. "Ezekiel said she was sleeping," the Reverend reported, "though I thought I heard movement from upstairs while we ate." 2 weeks passed. Mary remained absent from school. Neighbors began to ask questions, as neighbors do. Mrs. Hampton expressed concern about the length of the illness. "Even the worst fevers break within a week," she remarked to Patsy one afternoon, "or they take the child. But this lingering state—" She left the thought unfinished. Patsy found herself watching the O'Neal house whenever her duties took her past it. Sometimes she thought she saw a small face at an upstairs window, quickly withdrawn when noticed. Once she was certain she heard a child's voice calling from within as she walked past, though the words were indistinct. The following Sunday, the O'Neals did not appear at church. Reverend Caldwell, concerned, visited their home that afternoon, only to find it apparently empty, though smoke rose from the chimney. When he knocked repeatedly without answer, he circled to the back of the house. There he discovered Ezekiel emerging from the root cellar, carrying what appeared to be a bundle of bloodied clothing. Startled, Ezekiel quickly explained that he'd been butchering a deer he'd shot that morning. "The family's gone to visit Sarah's sister in Knoxville," he added. Mary's fever worsened. The city doctors might help her. The Reverend noted, but did not mention, that there was no horse or cart visible that might have transported a family to Knoxville, some 60 miles distant. That evening he shared his observations with Dr. Troxdale and Patsy. "Something isn't right in that house," the Reverend concluded. "I've had a feeling for some time now. The way those children watch their father like they're afraid to blink. The way Sarah seems to have withered these past months." Patsy, remembering the doll and Thomas's reaction, felt a chill settle over her. "Mary left a message," she said, and proceeded to tell them about finding the doll, the note hidden inside, and Thomas's fear when confronted. The 3 sat in silence for a long moment after she finished. "He isn't Papa," Dr. Troxdale repeated thoughtfully. What could the child have meant by that? Reverend Caldwell's face had grown pale. "There are stories," he said hesitantly, "old stories from the frontier days. Men who would murder a family and then assume their place, take over their lives, their property, their identity. Surely you can't think—" Dr. Troxdale began, but the Reverend cut him off. "I think we need to determine whether the real Ezekiel O'Neal is the man who's been living among us these 4 years," he said grimly, "and we need to find Mary." Silence has its own weight, its own presence. In the days following their conversation, Patsy became acutely aware of the silence surrounding the O'Neal property. No children's voices, no sounds of domestic activity. Even the chickens in the yard seemed unnaturally quiet, as if conscious of the need for stillness. Ezekiel continued his routine, walking to work each morning and returning each evening. Thomas was seen less frequently, and Joseph not at all. There was no sign of Sarah. The community began to feel the absence of the O'Neal family as a kind of vacuum at its center, a space where something should be but wasn't. Whispers started. Mrs. Hampton mentioned that Thomas had stopped attending school altogether. Mr. Finley reported that the boy no longer helped at the store. When Dr. Troxdale encountered Ezekiel on the street and inquired after Sarah and the children, the man's response was terse. Still with her sister. The city air is doing them good. His eyes, however, slid away as he spoke, focusing on a point over the doctor's shoulder. That night, Dr. Troxdale sent a letter to the physician he knew in Knoxville, asking discreetly whether he had treated a girl named Mary O'Neal. While they awaited a response, Patsy took to walking past the O'Neal house at different times of day. Once, she was certain she saw a curtain move in an upstairs window. Another time, she heard what sounded like muffled sobbing coming from within, though she couldn't be sure it wasn't just the wind through the eaves. The house itself seemed to be changing, developing an air of neglect. Leaves gathered unswept on the porch. A shutter hung askew. The vegetable garden that Sarah had tended so carefully began to wither, unharvested. It was as if the absence of the mother and children had affected not just the family, but the physical structure that contained them. 10 days after sending his letter, Dr. Troxdale received a response from Knoxville. His colleague wrote that he had made discreet inquiries and could find no record of a Sarah O'Neal or her children staying with any relation in the city. Furthermore, he had consulted church records and discovered something troubling. Sarah O'Neal had no sister. The day after receiving this news, Patsy observed something unusual. In the early afternoon, when Ezekiel should have been at work, she saw him returning to the house, moving with unusual haste. He carried a burlap sack that appeared heavy, its contents shifting as he walked. He glanced around furtively before entering, as if checking whether he was observed. That evening, Patsy shared what she had seen with her father and Reverend Caldwell. "We must alert the sheriff," the doctor decided. "There are too many inconsistencies now to ignore." The Reverend nodded in agreement. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I'll go with you to speak with Sheriff Tanner." But tomorrow proved too late. In the deepest part of the night, Patsy was awakened by the sound of urgent knocking. She opened her bedroom window to see Thomas O'Neal standing below, his face a pale oval in the darkness. "Please," he called up to her, his voice breaking, "please help us. He's going to kill Joseph next." The house stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness as Sheriff Tanner, Dr. Troxdale, Reverend Caldwell, and 4 other men from the town approached. Patsy followed despite her father's objections, unwilling to remain behind after what Thomas had told her. The boy himself had been left at the doctor's house, sedated with laudanum after his hysterical recounting of the past week's events. According to Thomas, the man they knew as Ezekiel O'Neal was not his father. The real Ezekiel, along with Sarah and Mary, lay buried beneath the dirt floor of the root cellar, their throats cut as they slept. Only Thomas and Joseph had been spared, kept alive to maintain the illusion of family life. "He made us call him Papa," Thomas had sobbed, "made us act normal, said he'd do to us what he did to them if we didn't." The man, whose real name Thomas didn't know, had apparently been watching the O'Neal family for months before making his move. He knew their habits, their relationships, enough details about Ezekiel's life and work to assume his identity without raising immediate suspicion. What he wanted was simple: the respectability of Ezekiel's position, the comfort of his home, the isolation that would allow him to indulge whatever depravities he desired without scrutiny. For 4 years, the masquerade had been maintained. Thomas and the real Joseph, terrified into compliance, played their parts. But Mary had always been rebellious, less easily cowed. When she threatened to tell Mrs. Hampton the truth, the man had silenced her permanently. He kept her in the cellar with them for days, Thomas whispered, singing to her at night. Then he brought up her clothes, all bloody. Sheriff Tanner raised his lantern as they approached the dark house. No light showed in any window. "We'll try the door first," he murmured to the men, quiet-like. "If he's asleep, we can take him without trouble." But as they reached the porch steps, the front door swung open. The man they knew as Ezekiel stood framed in the doorway, Joseph held against his chest, a hunting knife pressed to the child's throat. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Figured the boy would run eventually, weak, like his real father was." The standoff that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. The man demanded safe passage, a horse, supplies, and Joseph as insurance until he reached the territorial border. Sheriff Tanner tried to negotiate, to reason, but the knife remained steady against the terrified child's throat. "You don't understand," the man said, a strange light in his eyes. "I've done this before, become other men, lived other lives. I'll do it again." As dawn broke over the mountains, casting long shadows across the yard, the situation reached its breaking point. The man began backing toward the side of the house, still holding Joseph. "I'm leaving now," he announced. "Anyone follows, the boy dies before I do." What happened next occurred so quickly that accounts later varied. As the man turned slightly to navigate the porch steps, Joseph, perhaps sensing his last opportunity, suddenly twisted in his captor's arms and bit down hard on the hand holding the knife. Startled, the man loosened his grip just enough for Joseph to slip partly free. Sheriff Tanner fired a single shot, catching the impostor in the shoulder. He staggered but didn't fall, still clutching at Joseph with his uninjured arm. And then Patsy, who had circled behind the house while attention was focused on the confrontation, struck him from behind with an iron pry bar taken from the doctor's surgery. The blow wasn't fatal, but it was sufficient. The man crumpled to the ground, Joseph scrambling away toward the safety of Reverend Caldwell's outstretched arms. Within minutes, the impostor was bound securely, his wounds treated enough to ensure he would survive to face justice. But the true horror awaited them in the root cellar. Just as Thomas had described, they found 3 bodies buried beneath the packed earth floor. The real Ezekiel, Sarah, and Mary O'Neal had indeed been murdered in their beds, their throats cut with the same knife that had been held to Joseph's throat. They had been dead for years, their disappearance and replacement so gradual, so carefully managed, that the community had failed to notice the substitution. More disturbing still were the items found in a locked chest in the corner of the cellar, personal effects belonging to at least 2 other families, carefully preserved. Miniature portraits, wedding rings, children's toys, locks of hair tied with ribbon, labeled with names none of them recognized. Pages torn from family Bibles, recording births and deaths of people who had likely met the same fate as the O'Neals. The man who had pretended to be Ezekiel refused to give his real name. In the Morgan County Courthouse records, he is listed simply as John Doe, charged with the murders of the O'Neal family and suspected in the disappearances of at least 2 other families across the Tennessee-Kentucky border. He was hanged in Knoxville in the spring of 1847, taking whatever secrets remained with him to the grave. Thomas and Joseph O'Neal's subsequent lives offer another disturbing dimension to this story. After being taken in by relatives in Nashville, the boys initially appeared to recover from their ordeal. School records show that Thomas performed adequately in his studies, while Joseph was described by teachers as quiet, but not unusually so. Their guardian, a maternal uncle named Robert Cartwright, reported in letters to Dr. Troxdale that the boys were adapting to their new circumstances with a remarkable resilience. But this period of apparent stability proved short-lived. When Thomas was 16, he began to display unsettling behaviors. He was caught several times standing motionless in neighbors' houses, having entered without permission. When confronted, he claimed no memory of these incidents. He developed elaborate systems for securing the Cartwright home at night, checking windows and doors repeatedly, placing objects against entryways that would fall and create noise if disturbed. Most concerning were the journals discovered in his room, filled with detailed observations of the physical mannerisms, speech patterns, and daily routines of his classmates and teachers. Learning to be Edward Porter, read one entry, followed by pages documenting a schoolmate's every habit. Shortly after his 18th birthday, Thomas disappeared. A week later, Edward Porter, the schoolmate Thomas had been observing, reported that someone had broken into his home and stolen personal items, family letters, a Bible with genealogical records, childhood mementos. Edward himself disappeared 3 months later while traveling to visit relatives in Kentucky. A young man matching Thomas's description was seen using Porter's name in Lexington the following year, but the identification was never confirmed. Joseph's path was different but no less troubling. Where Thomas had been obsessive and methodical, Joseph became increasingly paranoid. By the age of 12, he refused to look in mirrors, covering reflective surfaces in his room. He insisted that certain people, often those he had previously been close to, had been replaced. At 14, he attempted to attack his uncle Robert with a kitchen knife, claiming the man wearing his uncle's face was an impostor. Committed to the Tennessee State Asylum in 1857, Joseph spent the remainder of his short life in institutional care. Asylum records describe his condition as incurable delusional melancholy with paranoid features. The attending physician noted that Joseph was preoccupied with questions of identity, both his own and others. He frequently expresses the belief that people can be hollowed out and worn by others, like garments. Joseph died in the asylum in 1864 at the age of 21. The cause of death was listed as failure to thrive, a common diagnosis for patients who simply stopped eating, drinking, and responding to external stimuli. Before retreating into this final silence, Joseph reportedly told his doctor, "I can feel him watching me through your eyes. He's almost finished becoming you." The doctor dismissed this as the ramblings of a disturbed mind. 3 weeks after Joseph's death, the same doctor left the asylum abruptly, withdrawing his entire savings from the bank in Nashville. He was reported to have taken a stage west, though no record exists of his arrival at any destination. His replacement at the asylum, reviewing Joseph's case notes, observed that the previous doctor's handwriting had changed subtly in the entries following Joseph's accusation, becoming more cramped, more angular, as if written by a hand attempting to mimic a familiar style but not quite succeeding. In the years that followed, Patsy Troxdale continued her work alongside her father, eventually becoming one of the first female physicians in eastern Tennessee. But those who knew her well said she was changed by what happened with the O'Neals. She developed a habit of studying faces intently, as if searching for something hidden beneath the skin. She kept detailed records of every family in her practice, noting changes in behavior or appearance, however slight. Her approach to medicine evolved in curious ways. Unlike most physicians of the era, who focused primarily on physical symptoms, Patsy became intensely interested in what we would now call psychological assessment. She developed a series of questions designed to verify a patient's identity, subtle inquiries about childhood memories, family relationships, specific experiences that would be difficult for an impostor to know. These questions were disguised within normal medical history-taking, but their purpose was clear to anyone familiar with her methods. "It is not enough to know if a patient is ill," she wrote in an 1852 letter to a medical colleague. "We must first establish that they are who they claim to be." This unorthodox approach earned her both respect and suspicion within the small medical community of eastern Tennessee. Some colleagues dismissed her as damaged by trauma, her judgment compromised by one terrible experience. Others, particularly those who had witnessed the O'Neal case firsthand, understood her caution and sometimes adopted elements of her methodology in their own practices. Patsy never married, though not for lack of opportunity. She received at least 3 proposals of marriage according to family records, including one from Sheriff Tanner, who had worked with her during the O'Neal investigation. She declined them all, offering various practical explanations: her commitment to her medical work, her responsibility to her aging father, her desire for independence uncommon in women of her era. But her private writings suggest another reason. "I cannot trust that anyone is truly as they appear," she confessed in her journal. "Each time I begin to form an attachment, I find myself watching for signs of wrongness, for evidence that the person before me is not who they claim. This is no foundation for marriage or, indeed, any intimate connection." Instead of conventional family life, Patsy devoted herself to the care of children especially, establishing a small orphanage on the outskirts of Coalfield that operated well into the 1880s. The Troxdale Home for Children, as it was called, became known throughout the region for its unusually thorough documentation of each child's background and development. Patsy insisted on collecting not just medical histories but detailed accounts of each orphan's origins, family connections, and early memories. She maintained extensive photographic records as well, beginning in the 1850s when photography was still a relatively new technology. Each child was photographed upon arrival and at regular intervals thereafter, the images preserved in leather-bound albums, along with handwritten observations. This system, excessive by the standards of the time, reflected Patsy's ongoing preoccupation with authenticity and continuity of identity. She was creating, in essence, a bulwark against the kind of substitution that had occurred with the O'Neals, establishing irrefutable evidence that each child under her care remained themselves, unchanged by any outside force. Her journals, preserved in the Morgan County Historical Society, contain repeated references to the O'Neal case, particularly to the man who had so perfectly assumed another's identity. "What hollowness must exist within a person," she wrote, "to allow them to empty themselves so completely that they might be filled with another's life? And more disturbing still, how many walk among us even now, wearing faces that do not belong to them, living lives they have stolen?" These philosophical questions gradually gave way to more concrete suspicions. By the mid-1850s, Patsy had begun collecting what she called incidents of substitution cases from across the region, where family members, friends, or associates reported subtle but persistent changes in someone they knew well. Most could be explained by natural causes, illness, grief, the normal evolution of personality over time. But a significant minority resisted such explanation. A husband of 30 years who suddenly could not remember shared experiences with his wife. A mother who developed unexplained aversions to food she had previously enjoyed preparing for her family. A respected deacon who began using phrases and expressions entirely out of character, as if adopting another's speech patterns. Patsy documented dozens of such cases, most dismissed by others as ordinary human inconsistency or faulty memory on the part of the observer. But she saw patterns where others did not, connections between seemingly unrelated incidents that suggested something systematic at work. "These are not isolated occurrences," she wrote. "They represent a phenomenon more widespread than anyone dares acknowledge, the gradual replacement of individuals within a community, conducted with such subtlety that even those closest to the affected person hesitate to trust their own perceptions." The most disturbing entries in Patsy's journals concern her suspicions about specific individuals in Coalfield and surrounding communities. She began tracking certain people with particular intensity, noting minute changes in their appearance and behavior. "Martin Holloway spoke today of his childhood in North Carolina," one entry reads, "though he has previously stated he was born and raised in Virginia. When I mentioned this discrepancy, he became flustered, then angry, accusing me of misremembering our prior conversations. But I am certain of what he told me, having recorded it in these pages at the time." Another entry: "Observed Mrs. Whitaker at church today. She wore her hair in a style identical to that favored by the late Mrs. Pemberton, down to the particular arrangement of pins. When complimented on the change, she appeared momentarily confused, then claimed she had worn her hair thus for years. Her daughter, standing nearby, seemed troubled by this assertion, but said nothing. These observations, scattered throughout decades of journal entries, paint a picture of a woman increasingly convinced that the horror she had witnessed with the O'Neals was not an isolated incident, but part of a wider pattern that whatever force or entity had possessed the impostor continued to move through the community, assuming new identities when necessary, perhaps even transferring from one host to another. Modern readers might dismiss these suspicions as paranoia, the understandable but irrational response of a mind traumatized by a singular, terrible event. Yet Patsy's observational skills were recognized and respected by her medical colleagues. Her diagnoses were proven accurate so consistently that doctors from as far away as Knoxville sometimes consulted her on difficult cases. If she saw patterns of substitution where others saw only ordinary human inconsistency, perhaps the failure of perception was not hers. The most haunting entry, dated nearly 30 years after the events described, recounts a chance encounter in a Knoxville hotel lobby. Patsy, then in her 50s, observed a well-dressed man speaking with the desk clerk. Something in his manner, a particular way he held his hands while talking, triggered a memory she couldn't immediately place. When the man turned and met her gaze, she felt a shock of recognition, though she couldn't have explained why. He nodded to her politely before exiting to the street. That night, unable to sleep, Patsy suddenly remembered where she had seen that particular gesture before, in the courtroom, as the man who had pretended to be Ezekiel O'Neal gestured while giving testimony. "I told myself it was impossible," she wrote. "He was executed. I witnessed it myself." And yet the resemblance was uncanny, not in feature, but in essence, as if something of him had transferred to another vessel. She spent the next day making discreet inquiries about the man, learning that he had recently arrived in Knoxville with his wife and children, purchasing a home in a respectable neighborhood. His credentials, his background, his references, all impeccable, all verifiable, all perhaps appropriated. "I did nothing," her journal concludes. "What could I do? Accuse a respectable citizen of being a dead man? Suggest that evil can transfer itself from one host to another? I have no proof, only this feeling, this terrible certainty, and so I have become complicit in whatever may follow. God forgive me." The journal entry is the last in the collection. 3 days after writing it, Patsy Troxdale died in a fire that consumed her home and office. The blaze was attributed to a knocked-over lamp. No foul play was suspected. The official inquest concluded that Patsy had fallen asleep while reading, the lamp overturning when she moved in her sleep. The resulting fire spread quickly through the wooden structure, trapping her inside. Her body was recovered the following morning, burned beyond recognition. Identification was made based on a distinctive silver brooch she always wore, found among the ashes. But even this most basic fact of the case contains unsettling inconsistencies. According to one witness at the inquest, the recovered body appeared smaller than Patsy's substantial frame would have suggested, though this was explained as the natural contraction of tissues during burning. Another witness, a neighbor who had seen Patsy earlier that evening, reported that she had not been wearing her brooch when they spoke, that she had mentioned lending it to a patient as a good luck charm for an upcoming journey. This testimony was given little weight against the physical evidence of the brooch's presence in the ruins. Most troubling is a document discovered in 2012 during renovation of the old Morgan County Courthouse. A stagecoach passenger manifest dated the day after Patsy's supposed death, listing a P. Troxdale traveling from Knoxville to Nashville. Historians dismiss this as coincidence. Troxdale was not an uncommon name in the region at that time, yet combined with other anomalies surrounding her death, it raises the possibility, however remote, that the woman who died in that fire was not Patsy Troxdale at all. That perhaps, in her final confrontation with whatever entity had haunted her since the O'Neal case, she became its victim, or worse, its vessel. But in Coalfield Township, the older residents still tell stories about the O'Neal tragedy and its aftermath. They speak of how the impostor smiled at his hanging, as if sharing a private joke with the executioner. They mentioned the strange coincidence of 3 other families in the region who lost their homes to fire in the months following Patsy Troxdale's death. Most unsettling of all, they whisper about a peculiar pattern repeated across generations. Approximately every 30 years, a respectable family man in eastern Tennessee is discovered to be someone other than who he claimed, his true identity erased, his origins untraceable, his predecessors vanished without explanation. The consistency of these events suggests something more than random crime, an intelligence at work, a method being refined over time. In 1875, a banker named Horace Wilson was revealed to have been living under an assumed identity after the real Wilson's body was discovered, buried in the cellar of an abandoned property he had once owned. In 1904, a Methodist minister in Maryville was exposed as an impostor when the brother of the man whose identity he had stolen happened to visit the congregation. In 1935, during the depths of the Depression, a WPA administrator for eastern Tennessee was discovered to have appropriated the identity of a man who had died years earlier in a mining accident, his scheme uncovered only when he attempted to access his victim's military pension. In 1963, a respected physician in Chattanooga was revealed to have stolen the identity of a medical student who had disappeared in 1957. The actual body of the student was never found. The last such case was documented in 1993, when a Joshua Mercer of Bristol was revealed to have stolen the identity of a child who died in 1957. Before being taken into custody, Mercer reportedly told investigators, "You can lock me away, but I'll still be sitting at your dinner table tomorrow night." He was found dead in his cell the following morning, an apparent suicide. No one could explain how he had obtained the belt he used to hang himself. What the official records of the O'Neal case don't reveal, what Patsy Troxdale's journals only hint at, is the psychological devastation that lingered long after the physical evidence was buried. The trial transcripts, yellowed and fragile in the county archives, contain testimony from Thomas that goes beyond the simple facts of the murders. Speaking in a monotone voice, the boy described how the impostor would sometimes forget which persona he was meant to be playing. "He would call me by different names," Thomas testified. "Sometimes he'd look confused, like he couldn't remember if he was supposed to be our father or someone else." Most chilling was Thomas's description of the impostor's nighttime ritual. Every night before bed he would stand in front of the mirror and practice being Papa. He would say Papa's words, make Papa's faces. Sometimes I'd hear him still doing it in the middle of the night, whispering to himself in different voices. The defense attorney tried to suggest that Thomas was confused, traumatized, inventing stories. But those who witnessed his testimony described the absolute conviction in his hollow eyes, the way his hands remained perfectly still in his lap as he spoke of horrors no child should have known. What the court records also omit is the testimony deemed too disturbing for the public. Accounts from Joseph, barely 4 years old, who spoke of the changing man, who would sometimes forget what face he was wearing. When asked to explain, Joseph said simply, "Sometimes he'd be Papa, but sometimes his face would go all loose, like it might slide off." Dr. Troxdale, who examined both boys extensively after their rescue, noted in his private papers that Joseph would sometimes stop mid-sentence during their sessions, staring fixedly at the door as if expecting someone to enter. When asked what he was looking for, the child would whisper, "I'm making sure he's not wearing a new face today." The impostor, who continued to insist he was Ezekiel O'Neal even after the bodies were discovered, presented a different kind of puzzle for the authorities. Sheriff Tanner's notes, preserved alongside the trial transcripts, describe a man of remarkable adaptability. "The prisoner changes his manner depending on who is questioning him," Tanner wrote. "With the judge, he affects the bearing of an educated man. With the guards, he adopts their rural speech patterns. It's as if he has no fixed self, but merely reflects whatever is before him." During his 3 months of imprisonment awaiting trial, the man reportedly charmed several guards into bringing him extra food, writing materials, even tobacco, items strictly forbidden to prisoners. One guard, upon being reprimanded, insisted that he'd never given the prisoner anything, despite being seen doing so by multiple witnesses. The guard was dismissed, but the incident hinted at the impostor's unusual persuasiveness. Dr. Samuel Woodward, superintendent of the Worcester State Lunatic Hospital in Massachusetts and one of the foremost alienists of the era, was brought in to examine the prisoner before trial. His report, sealed until 1902, contains observations that would later inform early studies of psychopathy. The subject displays no remorse, no empathy, no recognition that his actions constitute a moral transgression, Woodward wrote. More disturbing is his ability to simulate these emotions when advantageous, to present a perfect facsimile of human feeling while clearly experiencing none. He is, in essence, wearing humanity like a garment, one that he can don or discard at will. The most unsettling part of Woodward's report concerns the man's background. Despite extensive inquiries, no one could determine his true identity or origins. It is as if he materialized fully formed, without history, Woodward noted. The subject claims to recall his childhood in extraordinary detail, but each account contradicts the last. In one interview, he is the orphaned son of wealthy Charleston merchants. In the next, a poor farmer's boy from Western Virginia. He recounts both narratives with identical conviction, identical emotional resonance. When confronted with these contradictions, he shows neither confusion nor concern, but merely smiles and begins a new story. The sheriff's investigation into the impostor's past revealed more disturbing patterns. 2 years before the O'Neals moved to Coalfield, a family named Dawson disappeared from their farm near Cumberland Gap, some 60 miles to the northeast. James Dawson, his wife Elizabeth, and their 2 sons were presumed to have moved west after selling their property to a trader passing through. The trader, whose description roughly matched the O'Neal impostor, stayed in the area for several weeks, then departed. 3 months later, a man calling himself James Dawson appeared in Knoxville, claimed an inheritance left to the real Dawson by a distant uncle, sold the inherited property, and vanished. Sheriff Tanner found similar cases dating back nearly 15 years. Families in isolated areas who disappeared, their identities briefly assumed by a stranger who would extract whatever value could be obtained from their names before moving on. Most disturbing was the methodical escalation evident in these cases. The earlier disappearances involved single men, often prospectors or trappers with few connections. Later cases included couples. The O'Neals represented the first known instance where the impostor had maintained his deception for years, living among neighbors who might recognize inconsistencies. He was perfecting his method, Sheriff Tanner wrote in his final report, learning how to become others more completely for longer periods. I shudder to think what form this evil might have taken had it continued to evolve unchecked. The night before his scheduled execution, the impostor asked to speak with Patsy Troxdale. Against her father's wishes, she agreed to meet him in his cell, accompanied by Sheriff Tanner and Reverend Caldwell. The conversation, which she recorded in her journal later that night, haunts the margins of this case. "I've been watching you for some time, Miss Troxdale," the man said as she entered. "Even before you found the doll, you have a quality I admire, the ability to see what others miss." When she asked why he had requested her presence, he smiled. "I wanted to see if you could tell." "Tell what?" she asked. "If I'm still wearing Ezekiel," he replied, leaning forward, "or if I've already moved on." He then described in precise detail the layout of her bedroom at home, the arrangement of furniture, the pattern of the quilt on her bed, the hairbrush on her dressing table, with 3 strands of her dark hair caught in the bristles. "I've been there while you sleep," he said conversationally. "Not in this body, of course. But there are others who let me in. Others who make space for me inside them." Sheriff Tanner dismissed this as the desperate lies of a condemned man, but Patsy was struck by the absolute conviction in his tone. The impostor then made a request that chilled her blood. "When I'm gone tomorrow, I want you to look at them all, your father, the Reverend, the sheriff here. Look at them closely. One of them won't be quite right anymore. One of them will be wearing a borrowed face. I wonder if you'll be clever enough to tell which one." The next morning, as she watched him climb the scaffold steps, Patsy observed that the impostor showed no fear, no resignation, not even the grim determination common to men facing execution. Instead, he scanned the crowd of witnesses with evident interest, as if looking for someone in particular. When his eyes met hers, he smiled, not the desperate grin of a doomed man, but the quiet satisfaction of someone concluding one chapter of a longer story. In her journal, Patsy confessed that in the weeks following the execution, she found herself studying the faces of everyone she knew, looking for signs of wrongness, for evidence that someone familiar had been hollowed out and filled with something else. "The cruelest legacy of this man," she wrote, "is the doubt he planted. The terrible possibility that those we love might be taken from us not through death, which at least has finality, but through a subtle replacement so perfect we continue to live alongside the impostor, never knowing that the person we cherish is already gone." The tragedy's impact extended far beyond those directly involved. In the months following the execution, Coalfield Township experienced what Reverend Caldwell described in his sermons as a contagion of suspicion. Families who had lived as neighbors for generations began to withdraw from one another. Casual social visits declined. Parents kept children closer to home. Minor changes in behavior or appearance became subjects of whispered speculation. "Has James seemed different to you lately? Did you notice how strangely Margaret spoke at church?" The general store, once a hub of community interaction, grew quieter as people conducted their business with minimal conversation. Even church attendance suffered, as families increasingly preferred to worship privately at home rather than expose themselves to public scrutiny. Dr. Troxdale noted an increase in patients complaining of insomnia, digestive troubles, and nervous conditions, the physical manifestations of a community-wide anxiety. "We have become strangers to each other," he wrote in a letter to a colleague in Nashville. "The poison of doubt once introduced proves remarkably difficult to purge. Most affected were those who had been closest to the O'Neals. Mrs. Hampton, who had taught Mary, resigned her position at the school and moved to Knoxville, unable to face the empty desk where the murdered child had once sat. Mr. Finley closed his store for 2 weeks after the revelations, haunted by the memory of Thomas's fear that day. Among the spilled canned goods, Reverend Caldwell's sermons, once focused on salvation and divine love, turned increasingly to themes of discernment and vigilance. "The devil walks among us wearing familiar faces," he preached. "We must learn to recognize him, whatever form he takes." The impostor's body, after execution, became another source of unsettling tales. According to courthouse records, it was buried in an unmarked grave outside the Knoxville Cemetery, as was customary for executed criminals. But rumors persisted that the body had disappeared from the pine coffin before burial. A gravedigger, reportedly discovered drinking heavily in a tavern the night after the execution, claimed that when the coffin was opened for final verification of the prisoner's identity, it contained nothing but the clothing the man had worn to the gallows. The gravedigger was dismissed as drunk and unreliable, but the story spread nonetheless. Some versions claimed that the coffin contained not emptiness, but a strange substance resembling black oil or tar. Others insisted that the body had begun to transform in some way that the witnesses refused to describe. None of these accounts appeared in official records, and most historians dismiss them as macabre embellishments added to an already disturbing story. Yet the persistence of these rumors, their consistency across decades of retelling, suggests they address some deeper truth about the case, if not literal, then psychological. They speak to the community's inability to accept that the horror had ended, their lingering fear that evil so profound could not be dispatched by something as simple as a hangman's rope. In the decade following the O'Neal case, eastern Tennessee saw a marked increase in reported disappearances. Most were eventually explained: people moving west without notice, family estrangements, individuals seeking to escape debts, or unhappy marriages. But a significant number remained unsolved. John and Martha Ledbetter vanished from their home in Anderson County in 1850, leaving dinner half prepared on the table. William Cobb, a respected blacksmith in Madisonville, failed to open his shop one morning in 1853. Neither he nor his two teenage sons were ever seen again. The Harshaw family, father, mother, and 4 children, disappeared from their farm near Cleveland in 1855, though neighbors reported seeing lights and movement in the house for nearly a week after the family was last definitively sighted. In each case, investigators found no signs of violence, no evidence of the family's fate. And in each case, within months of the disappearance, strangers arrived in nearby communities, establishing themselves with suspiciously detailed backstories and references that, when checked, led nowhere. Few connections were made between these events at the time. Communications were slow, record-keeping inconsistent. It was easy for patterns to go unrecognized across county lines. Only decades later, when scholars began systematically reviewing regional historical records, did the unsettling frequency of such cases become apparent. A study published by the East Tennessee Historical Society in 1978 identified 27 instances between 1830 and 1860 that matched a specific pattern: family disappearance, followed by identity assumption. The study's author, Dr. Eleanor Marsh, suggested these cases represented the work of a migratory criminal element exploiting the isolation and limited law enforcement of frontier communities. Critics noted, however, that if multiple perpetrators were involved, the consistency of the method across decades was difficult to explain. Dr. Marsh's study remains controversial, its conclusions disputed. But the pattern it identified persists in the historical record, a ghostly outline suggesting something moving beneath the surface of documented history.